Good evening. My name is Phil Schomber. I'm the adult programmer for the Hedberg Public Library. And I want to thank all of you for braving the ice and the wind and the snow to be here tonight, because we do have a great program for you. We're fortunate to have the Master Gardeners here tonight. They've done a number of programs for us, and it's always excellent, so you guys are in for a treat. If you're not familiar with the Master Gardeners, that's a program that's offered through the University of Wisconsin Extension, and Master Gardeners receive extensive training in numerous areas related to gardening and natural resources, and then they take that knowledge and volunteer their time and expertise within their community. And we're fortunate to have them here tonight to educate us on the nature of pollinators and why they're important. So why don't I go ahead and turn it over to Mary Kay Thompson.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, everyone, for coming out tonight. Like Phil said, we didn't know, so I'm glad you're here. See this little guy up here? Well, he's quite obviously dead, and he is a sample of what we're seeing all over the country. Pollinators are in trouble worldwide. So why should we care about that? Well, these are coming out of a honeycomb or a beehive, and they may be the victims of colony collapse. It's really hard to say why they died. But here is why we need to be concerned about pollinators. This is what your produce choices would be with bees. This is what they would be without bees. Now that seems, well, there's plenty of oranges there and grapefruit and some lettuce and maybe some onions.
Don't orange trees need pollination?
Pardon me?
Don't orange trees
Yes.
need pollination?
Some of them do. So, one of every 3 bites of food that we eat every day, not just food that we eat directly, but also forage that feeds animals that give us meat, cheese, and other foods, are affected by this. What are pollinators? There's a lot of mystery about that, and there really shouldn't be, because there's an awful lot of information about it out there in the world. Bees are the most important pollinators. But over 100,000 invertebrates, including butterflies, moths, wasps, flies, and beetles, and over 1,000 mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians act as pollinators. That's a lot of critters. These important wildlife move from plant to plant while searching for protein-rich pollen or high-energy nectar. As they go, they are dusted by pollen, and when they move on to the next flower, they drop pollen grains, fertilizing the plant and allowing it to reproduce and form seeds, berries, fruits, and other plant foods that form the foundation of the food chain for other species, including us. There is no one cause for pollinator decline. This is the problem, and this is the mystery. It can be a result of a number of factors, the most common being habitat loss, and that means the guy that wants to farm fence row to fence row. It can be invasive species. We were fortunate enough to have the Southern District bee inspector, honeybee inspector, come and visit us last fall. And he told us that virtually every honeybee hive is infested with mites. So I went out on the internet when I got home and did a little research, and these mites attach themselves to the head of the bees. It's a parasitic thing. It's disgusting. Anyway. And pesticides. Pesticides. We all know about pesticides. We know that there was a time when pesticides were the savior of the American farmer. Well, not so much anymore. So, it's important that you understand that we can all make a significant difference in securing our food supply by working on the basic level by protecting our pollinators. Now this presentation was originated by our former UW Extension horticulture educator, Christy Marsden, who is no longer with the program. Ruth and I thought this was an appropriate piece of information to share with you. We did a little bit of tweaking on it, but not much. And so let's start out by looking at this beautiful pollinator garden here. Why do we care about pollinators? 75% of major food crops are insect pollinated. Most of those by native pollinators. And native pollinators are better pollinators. A honeybee pollinates at 1/100th of the rate of a native bee, of a solitary bee.
Why is that?
They're not native. Honeybees are not native. They have a different life than the solitary bee. Solitary bees, some of them only live from 3 to 6 weeks. Some of them live a year. Depending on the bee, all they do is create habitat for young. So they don't store honey. They don't spend any time going back and forth to the hive to drop off honey. They don't do any of that. All they do is go out and get food for their babies, for their upcoming babies. And all of this information over here, all of this wonderful information that Deb's got laid out for you, is how they help bees reproduce, how we can help bees reproduce. Honeybees, they're a whole different thing. They come from Europe. They're not native. And they don't pollinate at the same rate because of the way they live their lives. 70% or so of pollinators, native pollinators, live underground. They live in abandoned rodent nests. They dig in bare, sandy, or loamy soil. And let me just, 70% of our native bee species. They excavate underground. In order to build these nests, they need direct access to the soil surface. So in your garden, leave a bare spot or a couple of bare spots. And we'll get into other bare spots as we go along. Bumblebees, which is the remaining 30% of all of the native bees in Wisconsin, for example, make up only at 45 species. I'm sorry, what am I doing here? There are 45 species of bumblebees in the United States. And they are social bumblebees which have colonies with a single queen. Now they're like honeybees because they do make honey, they do store honey. They make little pots of honey. Okay, this shows what it looks like on the surface when they are digging their homes. Colonies are smaller than those of honeybees, growing to as few as 50 to 100 in a nest. Let me back up. The nests are constructed of pre-existing, as I said, underground cavities, chipmunk holes, rabbit holes. Occasionally, they will nest in hollow spaces like compost piles, hay bales, and above ground spots in yards like holes in an old rotten limb, something like that. Bumblebees can be active during cool periods when most other insects are inactive. So you'll find like late in the fall, here at our pollinator garden here at Hedberg, and you know we have one right out here. We watched bumblebees work and work and work weeks after everybody else had gone. Everyone else was gone. Okay. Nesting above ground. Holes in twigs, plant stems, stumps, snags. Carpenter bees will dig holes in wood. They'll use grass tussocks, piles of debris, cavities. And these are called social bees, honeybees, and bumblebees. Those are the two types of social bees. One queen lives with a worker caste of non-reproductive females and sometimes males. They are generalist foragers, which means that a species is able to thrive on a wide variety of environmental conditions, which can make use of a variety of different resources. Honeybee, Apis mellifera. This is the little guy that came over from Europe. Why so popular? They are easily reared and transported. Colonies can grow massive to upward of 50,000 individuals per colony. They can reach such high numbers because they overwinter and are considered perennial. How do they live in the winter? They huddle together and shiver for warmth and eat honey through the winter to survive. Not something that all of us knew, I would think. Bee foragers can travel up to 3 miles away to collect pollen and nectar, and twice as far if the nectar is good. In a single hive, workers may collect hundreds of pounds of nectar and tens of pounds of pollen in 1 year. This next picture is a killer. Isn't this beautiful? Honeybees use wax honeycomb as a nursery, and this is all exuded from their little bodies. The queen lays eggs inside these cells, which hatch into white grub-like larvae. The larvae pupate and emerge as bees. Collectively, rows of larvae in a honeycomb are called a brood. Then we come to my favorite little guy, Bombus, the bumblebee. There are 47 known species of North American bumblebees. Queens hibernate, emerge in the spring, and find a nest, wherever it might be. Each creates wax pots, and we'll show you that in a minute, to hold nectar and pollen, lays her eggs on the pots, and incubates them. Daughters emerge in the spring, forage, and help. In autumn, new queens and males emerge and leave to find mates. So, see you, Mom. Taking off. I'm moving. Queens hibernate, and everybody else dies. The queens collect nectar and pollen, only a small amount, for bad weather and for the babies. They buzz pollinate. Are you familiar with that? What buzz pollinating is? A process called sonication. They disengage their wings from the flight muzzles and shake their entire body at a frequency close to the musical note C. This increases the release of pollen from some flowers, and they can forage up to 1 mile from their nests. These are pots. I don't know if you can see them very well, but this is a pot. The top is open, and you can see honey in there. These are the little pots. If you wanted to, if you could probably dig that up, and it probably would be, it's rather helter-skelter. It's not as neat and tidy as a honeybee's comb. And if you picked it up, it might be about maybe this deep, maybe about this big around. And it's kind of, as I said, hodgepodge. This is the nest of a red-tailed bumblebee, Bombus lapidarius, and it shows the wax pots filled with honey. Okay. Solitary bees. What is a solitary bee? These are bees that live alone. Squash bee, mason bee, orchard bee, leafcutter, carpenter, and sweat bees. We all know what a sweat bee is. We've all had a can of pop with a sweat bee in it and got stung on the lip. Sweat bees are usually kind of a bright neon green, but there are other colors as well. Carpenter bees can actually do what it says. They can dig in the wood. Leafcutter bees, I ran into some leafcutter bees when I was taking some photos for a project. Came in, put the pictures on my computer, and realized that my leaves had perfectly concentric little holes in them. That's the leafcutter bee. They use those little wafers to line their nests. This is a squash bee, probably a male squash bee. This is what's called a specific pollinator. He likes squash, period. All of his kind like squash, period. These little guys will work and work and work all day long, getting the pollinator from those squash vines. And they get so tired they might fall asleep. Squash blossoms close up at night. And they may open in the morning and there'll be a little lazy, drowsy little bee in there. And he'll get back to work. This is a mason bee. Oh, and something else too about honeybees. You had asked why it's so different. Honeybees start foraging in the late afternoon. These guys, like the squash guy, he starts, as soon as he wakes up, he's foraging. Okay. Is that yours? Uh-oh. Okay, so this is the little guy where so much confusion comes about the name. A mason bee is definitely a solitary bee. Not all solitary bees are mason bees. It's just one of many. For nesting, mason bees use a mixture of mud or other masonry products in constructing their nests, which is made in naturally occurring gaps such as, this is interesting, cracks in stone or other small places or other dark cavities. When available, some species preferentially use hollow stems or holes in wood. And Deb has got a stem over there, if you could hold that up, Deb. That kind of stem. When fall comes and your lilies are done, leave them up so that the bees can come in and nest in them. Mason bees are solitary, non-hive producing bees. They are often confused with carpenter bees that use their mandibles to chew round holes in dry wood, including structural members of buildings. Mason bees utilize previously constructed holes made by wood-boring insects or hollow reeds in which to lay their eggs. This bee type includes the orchard bee, and they carry their pollen on their abdomen. They don't have the little pockets on their back legs. They carry it on their abdomen in a little untidy ball. This shows how a mason bee would do things. They would make their home, or actually this is probably a nursery. In here, they would put in some pollen and nectar and an egg. They would make a partition out of mud. Pollen, nectar, egg, mud. Until there are 6 or 8 in here. One bee can probably make 50 or 60 cells in her short little life. Many of these bees only live 3 to 6 weeks. Notice that these, I don't know if you can see very well, these tubes are made of pale blue paper. And Deb, if you could hold up some of those, okay. Blue, well, is that blue? Yeah, dark blue. Bees love the color blue. There's actual factual evidence that tells us that. They like the color blue. If you have blue, they're likely to go there. Okay. Here's my guy. Leafcutter. Now this one kind of doesn't show the real beauty behind these bees. These little guys are absolutely amazing. They can cut a leaf, they can cut a wafer out of a leaf in less than 4 seconds. And most of the time, they do it on the fly. They never alight. The fact that they caught this guy here alighting, or actually working on the leaf, is rather unusual. It's just, okay, anyway. They might use wafers of blossom. If there are some flowers around and the blossoms have large petals, they may use those. They also carry pollen on their abdomens. This shows, these are little wooden stems, hollow wooden stems. And this one has been plugged with some pieces of greenery. And here, and here. Carpenter bees. Pretty little thing. Carpenter bees look like bumblebees. They can dig right into wood to create their nests. And here's an example. This looks like maybe an old fence slat. It's kind of what it looks like. And you can see that at some point, they just started and made partitions and laid their eggs, put in pollen and nectar, and raised their babies in those partitions. This is a pretty little neon green sweat bee. And they like to sip your sweat for the salt in it and for, of course, the moisture, the water. And that's the reason that they hover so close to people during the heat of the summer. They may share the interest of entrances of nest holes, and they mutually guard and protect a nest. Alkali bees, whom prefer alkaline soils, are particularly good at pollinating alfalfa. Miner bee. It's called a miner bee because they actually mine their nests. They pollinate many different types of plants, and their burrowing, strangely enough, does not harm vegetation and may even be beneficial in aerating the soil. They are most active in early spring. Butterflies, and our beautiful little monarch here. We've all heard such bad news about butterflies lately. Let me back up here. I need more fingers. Okay. While not the best pollinator, we do love our butterflies. They consume only nectar as adults, so they can fly, find mates, and lay eggs. They don't gather pollen or provide provisions for young. They live most of their lives as caterpillars. That's why we need milkweed in everybody's backyard. They need warm temperatures and sunshine. So rocks, a few rocks, and we'll get into that later, set around in your yard for them to bask on are a good idea. They need open areas or those with good southern exposure. And to help them, provide sun-warm rocks for warmth and shelter from the wind. Skippers. These little guys, when they're at rest, they look like two triangles. Their outline makes a 2V structure when they're sitting still. They have a club on the end of their antennae. And they have characteristic erratic darting flight. And these, of course, are the ones that everyone loves. Swallowtails. Because they are just so incredibly beautiful. They're the largest of butterflies. They have tails on their wings. Most are black, yellow, or blue and white. They're strong flyers. They are found along wooded areas or stream corridors. To attract them, all you have to do, nothing really too exciting, all you have to do is have a mud puddle in your yard. And they'll come visit you. Whites and sulfurs, these are the little guys that nest or that fly in clouds. You just see these in just clouds, and you'll see them. These little guys are having a drink. They're in a moist spot. Widely distributed, conspicuous along roadsides, in meadows, and in gardens. They fly in a continuous fluttering pattern. They are mustard family plants. They like mustard family plants like cabbage and feed on plants in the pea family. They like legumes. Then we have these little guys. Karner Blue is right now, it's suffering. There's some thought that this too will get put on the endangered species list. We're not sure yet. But most of North America's smallest butterflies, coppers, hair streaks, blues, metal marks, have brightly colored surfaces with dots and checks. So got all these little dots here and all these little checks around the edge. They have hair-like tails and eyes like spots on their wings to fool predators. The Karner Blue butterfly is a specialist forager that feeds only on the wild lupine. Their population is in decline. The single most important factor causing its decline has been the loss of habitat due to suppression of wildfires. And that's something that has happened across the country, suppression of wildfires, because people consider it to be unsafe. And yet that was nature's way of creating the right environment for plants to resurge. Clearing land for farming is another problem. Developing land for commercial and residential purposes, not a surprise. Their natural habitat was previously in the Great Lakes dunes, and prior to that, formerly in the upper Midwest, east of New York and New Hampshire. So they have moved looking for habitat, and they're running out of luck. This is a fritillary, or a brush-footed butterfly, and these are in the same class as monarchs and painted ladies. They have 6 legs, like all butterflies, but their forelegs are very short, so they are often called four-legged butterflies. They come in many colors, with spots that can resemble eyes. A subfamily of those who feast only on milkweed, like the monarch, which is the only butterflies that regularly migrate thousands of miles to overwinter. Milkweed compounds make them poisonous to birds. Thus, nature has made them in colors of warning: orange, red. And then we have, does anyone know what this is? Okay, it's right, Sphinx. This is a moth, for those of you who aren't aware of what it is. Look at the length of that proboscis going into this little tubular flower here. Less likely to be noticed because of their generally drab color and nocturnal lifestyle. There are over 10,000 species, much more than butterflies, which only have 800 species. Many moths don't have mouths or digestive tracts. Take that in. They live on the nutrition in their bodies. When they run out of gas, they die. They only live to mate and lay eggs. Lunas, for example, those fabulously gorgeous lunas, have no mouths and no intestinal tract. Some plants require specific moths. The yucca plant, for example, has the yucca moth, and the evening primrose has the sphinx moth. Sphinx and hawk moths are some of the fastest flying insects known. They can fly up to 30 miles an hour. Think about that. A little dinky moth this big, 30 miles an hour. Zoom. They hover above flowers to feed. They can fly sideways. In the tropics, they have specific relationships with orchids, and the best time to view them is dusk or dawn. They like morning glories, various penstemons, and bee balm. Plant hosts for their larvae are viburnum, snowberry, and blueberry shrubs. Moths are, as a general rule, accidental pollinators. Have you ever heard that term before, accidental pollinator? What that means is they accidentally pick up some pollen grains, and they accidentally drop it off someplace else. It's not something that's part of their regular feeding routine. It just happens. And now Ruth is going to tell you more.
Hi, my name is, can you hear me? Is that working? Okay. My name is Ruth Flesher. I'm another one of the Master Gardeners. And now that you've seen the problem and met the pollinators, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what you can do to help and the kinds of plants that you can plant that will bring lots of pollinators to your garden. So as you, probably the most important thing that you can do for pollinators is to give them a safe place to forage and to nest. So if it's possible for you to avoid pesticides altogether, that's the best of all possible worlds. So some alternatives, maybe you can put a row cover over your kale so that the cabbage moths can't get at them. Or maybe you can hand pick those tomato worms. It makes my skin crawl, but I do it. Okay. You might consider whether maybe you can live with a few holes in the spinach leaves rather than kill off a whole bunch of your pollinators. Okay. If you have a problem, or you can choose resistant varieties of plants maybe that aren't going to get so much, say, dusty, powdery mildew that you don't need to spray them for you. Hello. Okay. So those are some non-chemical alternatives for you. If you decide you have a problem that really does require some sort of spray, I've kind of lost off the bottom here, but number one, choose the kind of spray. Don't go for a broad spectrum spray. Choose one that is as narrow, will only target as few as possible insects that will solve the problem. Okay, so a selective insecticide, and apply it when the bees are not active. If that means when the plant is not flowering, that's better. Or if it means, can you wait until nighttime when the bees are no longer actively flying about, that is also better. Okay. Very early morning. That way you can help protect the pollinators from being poisoned by creating one problem by trying to solve another one. Okay. I would say as well, there's a type of pesticide which is called a systemic pesticide. Are you guys familiar with what that means? Anybody not? Okay, well, they're very water soluble, and rather than just sitting on the leaves of the plant, they're actually absorbed either through the roots or into the tissues of the plant itself. So they go, and then they're moved throughout the entire plant. So that when a bee comes and it picks up the pollen or drinks the nectar, it's picking up that insecticide. And it may not kill that individual, but it will definitely weaken that individual. And then they take that pollen and nectar back to the nest, and they damage or kill the next generation as well. So systemic pesticides in particular are challenging for pollinators. So aside from not poisoning them, what's the next best thing that you can do for them is to give them, I said to give them safe places to grow and to nest, to have nutrition. And when you're talking about pollinators, their nutrition is flowers. So become a flower gardener. And the kinds of flowers that support the greatest numbers of pollinators would be local native plants. And the reason for that is that the insects and the flowers evolved together so that the flowers bloom at the right time for those particular insects. Those particular insects are most capable of utilizing those. You get the greatest bang for your buck when you're planting natives as opposed to either things that have been introduced or that have been developed through plant breeding. You don't have to use all natives in a flower garden, but consider adding in ones where you can. The more you have, the more pollinators you're going to see in your garden and that you will support. And we'll talk about individual plants that are really good for pollinators after a little bit, but there's some more things about gardening for pollinators that I'd like you to know first. Okay. Next thing you do when you're thinking about gardening for pollinators is you think about choosing several colors of flowers. And why would that be? Well, we have this lovely chart here that has all these pollinators across the top here, and on this top line, it says what colors they're attracted to. So for bats, green, white, purple. Bees, here's our blue, or bright white or yellow. Birds, scarlet, orange, red, white. Butterflies, bright red and purple. So you're seeing here that different things are attracted to different colors. So plant different colors to get more pollinators. And then the middle section of this chart is very confusing, and we're not going to pay much attention to it, but we are going to look down here at the bottom line where it talks about flower shape. And all of a sudden, bats are looking at one kind of flower. Bees are looking for flowers that are shallow that they can land on, or that they're tubular that they can crawl into. Okay, beetles, big bowls. Birds like large funnels. Butterflies, narrow tubes. Okay, so same thing here, where you've got different kinds of pollinators being attracted to different shapes of flowers, so plant different shapes of flowers. And when you're thinking about your flowers and setting out the design of your garden or adapting your garden to be more pollinator friendly, think about planting your flowers in clumps. And experts recommend that you have a minimum of 3 to 5 square feet of each different variety of flower. More is better. And planting in clumps does two things for the pollinators. It makes it easier for them to find the plants when they're out foraging, but it also is more efficient for them if they don't have to fly, if they only have to fly from here to here to here to here, as opposed to here to here to here to there. So it makes them stronger and healthier. They don't have to work as hard. They can produce more offspring. And another thing to think about when you're designing is variety in when the plants bloom. So try to get plants that bloom all season long, if at all possible. What happens if you have gaps in your bloom time is when things are blooming, your pollinators will feast, but when there's nothing there, they're going to starve. And so that cycle of boom and bust is very stressful for them, and it makes them less able to produce offspring and be less healthy. The time of year that's probably the biggest challenge to get, you want to have at least, again, this comes back to a recommendation of at least 3 kinds of flowers blooming at any given time throughout the season. So you need 3 in the spring, 3 in the early summer, at least. And that when it comes to August, that's no problem. Everything's in bloom in August. Springtime is probably the hardest, and we'll talk a little bit later about some more flowers that you might be able to add to your repertoire for pollinators for the early spring. But also remember that early spring is a time when lots of flowering trees are in bloom. And also a lot of trees that we don't think of as flowering trees, like your oaks and your maples, maybe locust, maybe willow, those all have flowers that the bees and the other pollinators can use. So when you're counting up your 3 plants in bloom at any given time, take a look around and don't forget the larger structural elements that are maybe in your yard or your neighbor's yard in addition to the flowers that you plant. Mary talked a little bit about nesting sites and leaving empty spaces in your garden. Okay? So I don't need to go into that too much. Mary said earlier that, well, Mary didn't say earlier, but she would have said, or she meant to say earlier, that a solitary bee might make as many as 20 foraging trips to provision each egg that it makes. And most solitary bees, she did say that the honeybees will travel for several miles, and the bumblebees up to a mile. But most solitary bees, which is the majority of bees, they won't go more than a few hundred feet. So they need places close by. For ones that, the ground nesting bees, the 70% of solitary bees are ground nesting bees. For those ones, you don't want to plant, maybe leave some empty places where you're not planting from fence row to fence row. Okay, give it a little breathing room, leave some, and don't mulch everything because they have trouble getting through the mulch to get at the ground. Leave spaces where they can dig. For the ones who nest in cavities, Mary mentioned, maybe brush piles, maybe rock piles, maybe dead wood. Basically, they really appreciate it if you're not too tidy a gardener. And along the same lines, if you're a person who normally cleans up your garden absolutely spotless in the fall, maybe you could rethink that a little bit. Maybe you could leave some of those downed stems or a little bit of brush and of course the seed heads that also help feed the small birds through the winter time. So. And then if you don't have anything appropriate or if you just can't stand that idea of leaving space or so forth, you can do homemade nests. These ones are woodblock nests. These ones down here are stem nests. And you can all check in over here with Deb, who has more information if you have any interest in doing that. And she can give you excellent information. You also have in this handout, Supporting Native Bees, there's information on how to manage the nests if you have them and how to help, also some more information about how to make them. And then these are just a couple more things that you could consider adding to a garden to make it a little more pollinator friendly. And Mary already talked about some of these. She talked about rocks for butterflies to help warm their bodies and absorb energy. These guys over here look like they're drinking water from this mud puddle, but what they're actually doing is they're actually getting minerals from the wet soil. So mud puddle, the rock, and this is a bee waterer. Even though they are drinking nectar as their food, they do need some additional liquid. And so what you've got here is rocks that are just barely emerging from water. And there's a sample over here as well. And you've got lots and lots of bees. They can land, they're safe, they can get at the water, it's not too far away from them. So and it's made, this one happens to be made from a dog waterer. So, but there are other ways you can do it as well. All you need is a shallow dish that you can put some pebbles in. Okay, so that's what I have on what you can do as far as gardening practices. So now we're going to move on and talk about what kinds of plants are good plants for pollinators. And I said you should try to get blooms all season. So these are organized according to bloom time. So for spring, I've got pictures of most of these, except spiderwort I don't have a picture of, or waterleaf or penstemon, but those I have pictures of on the board in the back, so you do feel free to take a look. So here's this. Oh, and most of these plants are going to need either full sun or can tolerate partial shade. Geranium can take a fair amount of shade. So if you have a shady yard, this is a good plant, and it blooms in the early spring. Baptisia, or wild indigo, this one happens to be a white one. It also comes in blues and yellows. There are also some cultivated varieties, but stick as much as you can to the native plants. And all of these plants are native plants. Oh, there is a picture of the spiderwort up here. Not a picture that shows you a real good indication of what the flowers look like. They have 3 petals, which is an unusual configuration. They're really pretty. And then here's the wild lupin that Mary was saying is the food for that Karner Blue butterfly, that really pretty tiny little butterfly. And unlike cultivated varieties of lupines, the wild lupines are really easy to grow. They are not finicky at all. Okay, so we start moving into plants. We're getting through April and May. Now we're beginning to get into June and July and things that start blooming. We've still got some of the Baptisia. Some of the different varieties start blooming at different times. What don't I have a picture of? I don't have a picture in the slides of this wild bergamot, but there is one on the board. There's another spiderwort. I don't have a picture here of the giant purple, but it's in the back. Okay, butterfly milkweed begins blooming in early summer. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these. Anise hyssop. This little plant is very easy to grow. We have some in the pollinator garden out back on the riverside of the library, and they were just buzzing all season, probably into late October.
With bumblebees.
Bumblebee, yes, bumblebees. Okay, that's anise, and it will reseed itself generously, so if you only have one to start with, you will soon have a 3 to 5 foot clump. It only takes a year or so. They reseed generously. Purple prairie clover, I love this plant, it's gorgeous. Tiny little clover-like leaves, and then there's also a white variety. And again, another easy to grow. Culver's root, that's a big one. That's a 5-foot plant. So that one you may or may not have room for. But if you have, it's a good plant for pollinators.
Isn't it a shade lover too?
It may well be. I'm not, do you know for sure? You may be right about that. Blazing star or Lycaeides, there are, again, multiple native varieties that start blooming at slightly different times and that are adapted to slightly different conditions. One might like drier soil, one might like wetter soil. So pick the one that matches your conditions most closely. And then that icon of the prairie plant, purple coneflowers. Purple coneflowers reminds me to tell you, plant breeders have taken a number of these native plants and have done amazing things with them. Except they're selecting for you, not for the pollinators. So this form, with its very simple cone and ray petals, your pollinators are going to like this better than the one with the tiny little, 10,000 tiny little petals where the cone, before you get to the cone, they can't even get in there past those little short petals to get at the pollen and nectar. So in this is a case when old-fashioned, simpler is going to be better for your pollinators. Okay, so this butterfly milkweed was in the last slide, but we've got a picture here, so they continue blooming into the autumn. I think most of these, there are pictures of, so I'll just move right along to the pictures. Okay, how many of you know that this is a type of milkweed? Excellent. So this is something that will help support your monarchs. If you don't like the look of common milkweed or you don't like the way it behaves, because it does tend to spread, this is a much better behaved alternative, and it will still serve the purpose of feeding your milkweed, your monarch caterpillars. And again, it's not too hard to grow. In fact, there are probably about a dozen different varieties of milkweeds. Again, pick the one that suits your conditions best or that you like best. But they will all work. And they also host all kinds of, in addition to the monarchs, tons and tons. There's this really strange looking milkweed tussock moth, which is orange and has sprays of hairs sticking out. It's a strange looking critter. But anyway, tons and tons of insects and pollinators and beneficial insects are all supported by milkweed. It's a great plant to plant, whatever variety of it you have. Joe pieweed, again, and tends to be a bigger plant. You may or may not have room for it. And here is a perennial native variety of sunflower. Our next picture has a woodland sunflower, again a perennial, and seems fairly obvious that this might tolerate more shade than the other one. Great blue lobelia is, again, a lovely plant. If you have, it grows on average soil with average moisture in full sun. If you have more shade or more wet soil, you can look for its cousin, which is screaming red, which is called Lobelia cardinalis, or cardinal flower. And then here we have a picture of a spotted bee balm. This is not a usual form for a bee balm. You think of bee balms, you think of the garden variety with the interesting shapes that look like the wild bergamot that's on the board back there. This is a different shape for a monarda, but it works just as well for attracting pollinators. And as you get really late into the season, we're talking about starting to bloom in late August, September, and continuing into October. You've got the various varieties of goldenrods and New England asters, the purple over in that one. This one is the roadside variety that you see everywhere, the showy goldenrod. The stiff goldenrod and the Riddell's goldenrod are slightly different forms, again, slightly different conditions, but all good pollinator flowers. So all of these that I've just showed you have been perennials and herbaceous plants. Let's look at some trees and shrubs. Most of these I have pictures for, again, so we'll just, oops. Okay, blueberries. If you're growing blueberries, they need a really acid soil, so most people in this area don't have the kind of acid soil that they need, so you have to do a lot of work to make them grow around here, whether it's the high bush or the low bush. And by the way, the low bush are the recommended ones for this area. So you're probably growing them for the fruit, if you're growing them at all, but know that they are also a good pollinator plant, so you can count them among your 3 plants in bloom if you're doing all that work to begin with. Serviceberry is a native spring shrub. Pussy willows are also an excellent pollinator plant, particularly for bees, and they come in, each plant is either male or female, so if you can get the male, which has the pollen, that's better for the pollinators than the female version. We've got a couple varieties of spireas here, and then over there on the right, a prairie plant, which is known as lead plant. And some more woodies. We've got roses. Notice that these are not these are not florist roses, okay? These are very simple forms, not doubles, not hybrid teas by any stretch. But the fact that they are this open lets the pollinators land on them and get at the pollen and the nectar more readily than they could the more highly bred roses. And also your native fruit trees or orchard trees. Again, they're going to bloom early in the spring. How many of you know New Jersey tea? It's not a real common shrub. It's about 3 feet tall, and it has those lovely white blooms on it. So that's something that, it's a well-behaved plant that might do well in a garden situation. And then if we're talking about trees, don't forget, I mentioned oaks and maples and willows and so forth, but also American basswood. It has the most wonderful sweet smell. It blooms, I think, June, early summer. It's not a spring bloomer. And then you can make tea out of the blooms as well. So it can feed you as well as your pollinators. And then I said that you didn't have to have all native plants. The higher the percentage, the more pollinators you're going to get. But there are also some non-native plants that are good ornamentals that are good for the pollinators as well. And I'll show you pictures of a lot of them. This is oregano and Russian sage. They're all very popular. And this says catnip, but I believe that the photo is catmint. But I don't think it matters because they're both good pollinator plants. Here's borage. This is an edible herb. These pretty blue flowers are edible, and the leaves, when they're young, they're a little furry, but they taste kind of like cucumbers. You can put them in salad, and again, the bumblebees just go nuts for this plant. Did you notice that these last four are all different varieties of herbs? Okay. You can also pick up some of the other varieties. They like thyme, they like sage, they like some of the annual ones, parsley blooms, fennel. Swallowtail caterpillars will feast on fennel. So an herb garden is another way you can take care of your pollinators. Cosmos is very popular. They also come in a yellow and orange colorway. That would be Cosmos sulphureus rather than Cosmos bipinnatus. And then this is your annual garden sunflower. But be careful when you're picking sunflower varieties because some of them have been bred, again, selected for people, not pollinators, so that they don't have pollinator, because a number of people are allergic to the pollen. So there are some varieties out there with no pollen. So if you want to plant for the pollinators, be sure you get a variety that does have pollen. Okay. So again, this is just a starting point of a laundry list of plants. There may be some in your packet. There's certainly all kinds there's this lovely book over here, 100 Plants to Feed the Bees, talks about natives, non-natives. It's from this library. I have it checked out at the moment, but I'm returning it when we're done here. So it's an excellent book. There's all kinds of resources over here. I'll touch on that a little bit later. Just be sure when you're picking out plants, with all the other things that you have to consider, make sure that you are matching the plants to your conditions so that you're not trying to put something that needs really wet soil in a dry area and vice versa. And also make sure that what you're planting is not going to end up being invasive. Okay, so that's the garden portion of all of this. So to kind of summarize what we've talked about, we know that more pollen and nectar sources provided by more flowering plants and trees means that you will end up with more pollinators and healthier pollinators. And the best way to bring bees and butterflies and birds and bats and beetles and other pollinators to your yard is, number one, eliminate the insecticides, and number two, plant for them. Give them food, give them shelter. A few odds and ends of other things that you can do. You can plant for the monarchs. You can plant the milkweeds. There are some seeds in the back. There are also some herb seeds in the back. The herb seeds are a couple years old, but they should still be good. And if not, well, if they don't come up, the price was right. You don't have a lot invested, but they should be okay. I would plant them without a hesitation. So help yourself to anything back there. As you look beyond your own yard and start to think about what else you can do to help pollinators, you can help to spread the word. There's there are a number of organizations that have national and local initiatives. One of them is the Xerces Society for, lovely, thank you. You can get a sign to put up in your yard to say that you have declared your yard a pollinator habitat. And it will help to spread the word to other people to say, I'm doing something about this. Why don't you? Okay. And these are available from the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. That is spelled Xerces, and their website is xerces.org. And they are the source of many of these wonderful books over here. This is a very basic book, Attracting Native Pollinators. Gardening for Butterflies. You do have a handout on gardening for butterflies there as well. The 100 Plants to Feed the Bees is from Xerces. Farming with Beneficial Insects, which are insects which prey on other bad insects. Okay, and a lot of the things that benefit pollinators also benefit beneficial insects. So that's closely related, although not quite directly. There's some information here from the USDA. You can learn more from the Fish and Wildlife Service. There are lots of places where you can learn more and share more, and you can join things like the Million Pollinator Garden Challenge. You can go to, you can look up, you can Google, you can search for the Pollinator Partnership. All kinds of information out there for all kinds of things. And of course, don't forget your local library as a resource. Okay. Thank you very much for being here this evening. Please come up and take a look here. The board in the back has more pollinator plants listed there, some that I didn't have pictures of in the slideshow. And Deb's got all kinds of information on bee houses and bee nesting. So.
And I would really recommend it if you have children or grandchildren and you want to get them involved in the whole pollinator initiative. Deb can show you a way in which you can help your child become an actual vital part of the pollinator movement, and that's by making these little tin cans full of hand-rolled paper. We've done many, many projects with children, and kids just love them. They just love them, and they're so easy to make.
Do the bees love it?
Yes, they work just fine. That's a 14.5-ounce soup can and a 4-inch wide white paper that you can get in a little pad of paper at your dollar store.
Already 4 inches.
Yeah, so exactly the right size. You roll them up, you use a glue stick and stick them together, and one of those, yep, there you go. And one of those little cans, if a bee works her little self to death, which she will, of course, laying eggs and setting up these little brood cells, there are 220 cells approximately in each one of those 14.5-ounce cans. It's an exciting idea for kids. They really grab onto it. They love it.
A great thing to do when they're home for snow day. Here, kids.
Is it though?
Tubes. Hold them on.
Oh,
Can't
yeah.
hear me?
There you go.
Hear me now?
No.
No. I'm sorry. I'll talk louder. It's a great thing to do with your kids when they're home on a snow day. Here, we're going to roll tubes. I would like to add something about the plants for pollinators. I work at the garden up by the jail, and we put an orchard in this year. And one of the things that we're going to do in our orchard and in our raspberry bushes is to plant Dutch white clover. And that's something that blooms very early. It's a great early source for bees. It's something you can walk on and it recovers. You can mow over the top of it, it recovers. So we're going to put it in areas that we're not walking on a lot, but it's close and it's early and it continues to bloom through the season for the bees.
Any more questions?
Where do you put those cans then outside?
Come on up, Kay. Come on up and take a look.
You would place them securely. You don't want them to move around. You know, bees don't like that. A lot of times you can take a zip tie and then put it, you would want it like under an eave or a protected area so that the water can't get in. And you want to tip it down just slightly.
And
so
you
that-
can-
So the water will, you know.
And you can put a little, you can put, if you want, you can fold a piece of stiff cardboard in half and make a little roof. So that it sticks out over the end so that it doesn't get wet, so that the ends of them don't get wet.
If you can also put it someplace that gets a little bit of morning sun, it
Right.
helps wake them up and get them going.
And they should be 4 feet off the ground.
Yep, at 4 feet off the ground, very secure.
Yep.
You really should use paper. You can get paper straws at your local dollar store, a dollar store will open. Cut them up. Usually 4 inches is good. Most of the cans are 4 inches. Make sure you clean that can out really good before you put anything in there. And your house should always have a back. So the cans have a really good back. If you're going to make something, for example, like this, you know, it has a very solid back. This is actually a very nice bee house that you can purchase one of your local, you know, garden shops or whatever. It has a variety of size of holes in here, which is a good thing.
Yeah, different pollinators will go to different size holes.
And they'll sort that out themselves, so you don't have
Yeah.
to worry about that.
Right. They recommend between 2 millimeters and 10 millimeters. So if you're going to drill holes, which is a great thing to do in the winter also, get little branches, all different sizes are good, and then just drill a bunch of holes straight in. The larger diameter holes would require drilling in a little bit deeper. So I think that in your
5 to 6 inches for the holes, a 1/4 inch or larger, and 3 to 4 inches for smaller than 1/4 inch.
And make sure that your holes are good and smooth on the inside.
Exactly.
Because bees have very fragile wings. So
Very fragile
she's going to be going in and out of those tubes to lay her eggs and put the food in and make her cells. So we want to make sure her wings stay safe.
If you look inside this one, you will see residue, very sharp pieces of residue that are left over. So if you do purchase something like that, you're going to want to clean those out and make it nice and smooth before you.
Ruth had
Q-tips
mentioned,
might be a good idea.
Q-tips?
Maybe.
Right. I don't know if a Q-tip would be strong enough to get some of this.
You can actually take your drill and re-drill them to
Yeah.
smooth them out.
Yeah.
But the other thing to know about them is that, like any place where you have a concentration of life forms, parasites come.
right,
And so you're going to want to replace your tubes if you're not using paper, or sterilize them at least every 2 years.
and you would
If you're
ster-
using the paper tubes, you can just replace the paper tubes every year. That's no problem.
and the sterilization should be a 10% solution.
Of bleach and
Right,
water.
of bleach and water.
Right, your handout gives you some very good maintenance tips on doing that. And they also recommend that when you remove the nesting areas, some of those bees might not have emerged yet.
So don't bring them inside.
They recommend taking a bucket and turn it upside down and create an emergence chamber, and I believe that is in your information also, where you would just put a hole near the bottom so that, and then you turn the bucket upside down, you put you put your stuff in there, put your bucket upside down, and then when they emerge, they can come out the bottom. So you're still preserving the ones that have been in there. It's really difficult. I have a picture of my bee house here, which has a lot of different types of habitats available, different size holes, different kinds of, I have paper tubes, I have daylily tubes, I've got some blocks of wood that we just drilled holes in. You don't want to use plastic straws because the parasites and diseases will start with those.
Yeah, the moisture won't dissipate with
Right.
the plastic straws.
From my experience on mine, I've noticed that they really prefer natural. I have paper tubes in there and they only used a couple of them. I have a couple straws, I used a couple of them. But I have daylily tubes that I spent a winter cutting, and they use those like crazy. They loved them.
So you
And-
cut the tubes off and you put them in the can.
Or
Or in some, I found this at a rummage sale. This is an ideal spot, or a little box, you know. I could put some chunks of wood in here, drill holes in there, put some chunks of wood. I could have some that are like branches that I've got, and then I could fill this all up with something like this. And sometimes they recommend, you know, like use a toilet paper tube, because you want them to be bunched. You want them to have them like a bundle, and it's a little easier to bundle this way.
And you can make bundles of twigs, bundles of those empty daylily, or those hollow daylily tubes. Just a bundle of them, and just put them by the side of a fence maybe, or someplace nice and safe. It's amazing what you can find to use that would be a good habitat. It's everywhere.
We've even taken logs, you know, just this long, and drilled holes in each end. And then we take them and put them out in our orchard in the trees and tip them just slightly, you know, whichever way the holes are. And they use it. It's amazing. The daylily tubes, when you cut them, then you can get some sharp edges on them, so that's something that you really want to be careful with. And the other thing I've noticed is on the cans, some of these cans have a little ledge right around the edge of the inside.
Yeah, if
very
you've got a can opener that cuts on the outside of the can, those are better than the ones that cut through the lid.
Right.
This is an example my friend bought me. Very pretty, isn't it? It's very nice. It has issues though, because it's not secure. It moves around. These are plastic straws, and they bundled them. It looks like they glued them together. That's not a good thing. I would have, if I was going to do something like this, I probably would have used twine or something more natural. And also, I don't know if it has a back. I can't tell. You can tell it was used a couple times, because you can see where things have daubed up and then emerged. So they did use it, but this really isn't something that I would recommend.
So in the category of they'll nest anywhere that they find an appropriate spot, I have some rain barrels that have some double spigots on them. They're Y-shaped, the spigots, and I only use one side of it. Well, this fall when I turned my rain barrel upside down for the winter to empty it, the unused spigot had a mud plug in it. So they'll find appropriate spots. Other questions? Yeah.
Not a question, but a statement. Rock County Conservationists is encouraging pollinator gardens with schools.
Excellent,
So
yes.
if you know a teacher or a principal that would be committed to maintaining a pollinator garden, Rock County Conservationists will provide educational materials as well as plants, as well as advice on how to get it started. But you need somebody who's committed to it.
Which reminds me, I had meant to say a little something about sources for some of these plants. They're not hard to find. Even some of the big box stores will have a section that has some native plants. There's a gentleman at the farmer's market here in the summertime who has native plants for sale. You can go to, there's several prairie nurseries. This is Prairie Moon Nursery. It's out of Minnesota, but that's fairly local as far as, you know, the type of habitat and so forth. They have excellent information, and their seeds are $2.50 a packet, and almost everything comes as a seed. Some of the seeds can be a little more challenging than other garden plants because they may require special treatment, but if you're not intimidated by that, that's a great way to go. We're also fortunate that we have over in Edgerton a company called Agricol. It is Edgerton, Evansville, not Edgerton, excuse me. They are one of the largest native plant nurseries in the area, and a lot of the other places get their native plants from Agricol.
Our friendly farmer at the farmer's market gets his seeds, his
Yes,
sets
he
from
does.
Agricol.
He does. And they do have retail as well as wholesale. So
You can set up, you can get a flat of plugs of the array or the assortment
Okay.
that you want from them. You just work with them, and I want 5 of these and 2 of these, and
Plants, bare root plants too.
I'm sorry.
Bare root plants, that's where we get the gardeners from, like the seed plant itself.
And
Yes.
the Rock County Conservationists
Also
also
have a
have
sale.
a big sale in the spring usually, right?
It's, I think, the second Saturday in May.
Okay.
That makes sense. That sounds like
And
what we've had
it's,
before.
it's at the Rotary Center in Beloit. And you can pre-order.
Yep.
And they are very inexpensive. If you're a member of the Rock County Conservationists, it has been in the past generally $2.50 a plant, which is dirt cheap for a plant these days. Or if you're not a member, it's $3, which is still a very reasonable price. And obviously, I can't speak to their future pricing, but it has been very reasonable. And you can check.
The third Saturday this year, so it's
Okay.
the 18th.
Okay. Good Mother's Day gift.
I accidentally brought in a little habitat in my kitchen a couple weeks ago. I brought in some bamboo wind chimes from outside, and now I took some pictures and I was observing them, but they're trying to get the windowsill and they're very subdued because it's cold. I think they may be long-horned bees, but I may be wrong. I'm not an expert, but I'm interested in learning some of this. That's down here.
Okay. Another thing you can do if you're interested in citizen science,
I got about 10 of them hanging out in my kitchen.
there. Oops. Poor babies.
And I painted my kitchen blue too.
Oh, good.
There's a citizen science project called Bumblebee Watch, that you can join in, and they'll give you a little bit of training, and then you go out and you take pictures of bumblebees in your garden, and you send them in, and you say, I think this is blah, blah, blah. And they will confirm for you, yes, this is a male rusty-patched bumblebee, which happens to be an endangered
on the
bumblebee.
endangered species
We are
list.
fortunate that we have them in this area. One of our fellow master gardeners has a pollinator garden. She is a member of the Bumblebee Watch, and she has confirmed sighting in her garden of rusty-patched
And a
bumblebees.
second one of our master gardeners saw one of them at a botanical garden, a rusty patch bumblebee. So they're doing fairly well around here, but they're
They could use all the help they could get.
Right, Xerxes that Ruth was discussing earlier as such a vibrant source of information about pollinators and invertebrates. They are responsible in large part for the rusty patch getting put on the endangered species list. They lobbied for that quite heavily about 4 years ago and were successful. And the rusty patch is the only bumblebee in the continental United States. There were other bumblebees that were declared for the on the EPA list in Hawaii, right, previously.
Here's a postcard with the information on Bumblebee Watch if anybody wants to. Any other questions or comments? Okay, we'll let you go. Take a look at the materials. Thank you for coming tonight. It was fabulous.